On June 23, 2012, at about noon, Colorado Springs experienced the beginning of what would prove to be a historical disaster for the city. By June 26th, the weather forces and fuel created a disaster in which 2 people died, some 346 homes were destroyed, and 18,247 acres in the Pike National Forest and in the city of Colorado Springs burned. This, the Waldo Canyon Fire, forced the evacuation of 30,000 people. I was involved in this fire in that I was one of the hundreds who helped in the evacuation and also housed a family in my basement that was displaced by the fire. I have called Colorado Springs my home now for 16 years. This fire was very personal to me as many of my friends were touched by it. But it is also very personal because for the last 40 years of my life, since I was 2 weeks old, I have spent every summer at Huntington Lake. And I know that what I saw during the Waldo Canyon Fire, we could also see happen in and around the forests of Huntington Lake and the Sierra Nevada mountains. My name is Greg Burke, and Huntington Lake is one of my most favorite places on earth. My great-grandfather and grandfather built our cabin at Huntington in the late 1940s. Now my children, the 5th generation of family to enjoy this beautiful and unique heritage, are growing up, spending their summers there as I did, and continue to do. I want to take this opportunity to show you why I fear that the same tragedy that happened in Colorado Springs and Waldo Canyon can happen at Huntington. I will share some facts and opinions regarding the cause of this fire, as well as the cause of the Hayman Fire, which was a very similar fire that occurred in June of 2002. I will show you the devastation caused by the Waldo Canyon Fire. I'll explain the similarities of the Pike National Forest and the Sierra Nevada Forest. I'll describe what the result of a forest fire in the Huntington Lake Basin would most likely be. And finally, I'll describe what we can do to mitigate the danger of such a thing happening to our forest and our cabins. Let's start by discussing the conditions surrounding the Waldo Canyon Fire. The case study results for the Waldo Canyon Fire are not available yet, but I can still review with you the conditions on the day of the fire, as well as the probable contributing causes of the fire. Sarah Mabin is the Renewable Resources Staff Officer, this is similar to the Chief of Staff, to the Forest Supervisor of the Pike National Forest headquartered in Pueblo, Colorado. Her responsibilities include oversight of wildland fire, hazardous fuels reduction, timber, wildlife, range or livestock grazing, watershed health, and water rights. When we asked Ms. Mabin what she believed the contributing factors to the Waldo Canyon Fire were, she said that in her opinion the drought conditions and the density of the trees and fuel from years of forest fire suppression in the canyon were the main causes. Another contributor was the heat that day, an unusual 101 degrees. And finally, the wind contributed to this perfect storm. According to meteorological data, the wind speeds that day were 15 miles per hour, with gusts up to 25 miles per hour. In contrast to the meteorological data, we heard in the media that the wind speeds that day reached 65 miles per hour. But according to Ms. Mabin, this was caused when the smoke column collapsed. The smoke above the fire was similar to a rain cloud that drops its rain when it becomes too heavy to hold it any longer. The smoke cloud became heavy with all of the debris from the fire, and there was an unstable atmosphere present due to the thunderstorms in the area. When the column collapsed, it created the 65-mile-per-hour winds. Interestingly, the fire was the cause of the high winds, not the other way around. Ms. Mabin also referred us to the final case study of another very similar fire, the Hayman Fire of June 18, 2002. According to the finalized Hayman Fire case study summary by Russell T. Graham, historically, wildfires had burned over the western forest throughout history. These were either started by lightning or the Native American Indians and were successful in thinning out the low-lying brush and small trees, which allowed for the stronger growth of the taller, stronger, fire-resistant trees. Then, in August of 1910, fires burned over 3.1 million acres in the Rocky Mountains, killing 85 and destroying entire towns. According to Graham, this event solidified the negative aspects of wildfires in the view of the public and policymakers and led to the strong firefighting ethic that prevails yet today. Wildfires continue to be aggressively extinguished with smoke jumpers, hotshot crews, retardant bombers, and sophisticated firefighting organizations. On June 8, 2002, after almost 100 years of continued fire suppression, the conditions became perfect for the progression of the Hayman Fire that resulted in the destruction of 60,000 acres of forest. According to Graham, the fuels downwind from the ignition point were continuous, consisting of trees with low crowns, shrubs, and a deep layer of needles on the forest floor. He goes on to say, low crowns of the shorter trees facilitated the transition of the fire from the ground surface to burning tree crowns or their tops. The fire burned with extreme intensity with long crown runs, in other words, fire running through the tops of the trees from tree to tree. No suppression actions were possible. During the conversation with Ms. Mabin, she also mentioned what she called the teachable moment following the Hayman Fire. She explained that this is the time following a devastating fire when the public learns about the disaster, its cause, and usually takes action to prevent a similar occurrence in the future. She said in the case of the Hayman Fire, the teachable moment was short-lived and not taken seriously. The public decided that they would take the risk of another such fire so that they could maintain the aesthetics of the dense trees around their homes and cabins. Thus, no fire mitigation in the Pike Forest was done. I have recently driven through the area of the Hayman Fire, which took place 11 years ago, and the devastation remains to this day with very little sign of forest recovery. On June 26, 2012, the heat, the drought, the wind speeds, 15 to 25 miles per hour, and the abundance of fuels led to one of the worst natural disasters in Colorado history. Here is a review of the Waldo Canyon Fire and pictures of some of the things I saw that day. Now I want to focus on the Sierra Nevada and the conditions that are prevalent there and at Huntington Lake. We all know that the lake is known for its regattas every summer because of the length of the lake and the winds that come up every afternoon, making it an ideal lake for sailing and very popular for sailors all over California. According to meteorologist Miles Musio, on a typical summer afternoon, winds gust to 20 miles per hour. During thunderstorms, that could easily double. Afternoon winds come up the canyon from the southwest and often gust to 25 to 30 miles per hour. Please take note of the similarities between the typical wind conditions at Huntington Lake and those of Waldo Canyon that contributed to the fire. This year, the Sierra Nevadas are experiencing the second consecutive year of a drought. These drought conditions are common in this mountain range. As the years of drought conditions continue, the trees and brush become drier and drier. Recall that drought was also considered one of the main contributors to the Waldo Canyon Fire. While the drought conditions are not identical, according to Ramiro Rojas, District Silviculturalist, High Sierra Ranger District, there have been 3 drought cycles in the past 100 years that equal current drought conditions of the forest, based on NOAA data. One of these was before the Big Creek Fire in 1994. The others occurred in the late 1970s and mid-1920s. During the last 50 years, drought conditions have dominated. Approximately 70% of the last 50 years have experienced drought conditions severe enough to contribute to high risk of bark beetle attack. Drought combined with high tree density and air pollution increases tree stress and the potential for high-intensity fire. We cannot change the pollution or the climate conditions in the short run, but we can change the tree density and give these trees a drink of water by thinning now. The temperatures in the Sierra Nevada mountains have never gotten to the record high of Colorado Springs during the Waldo Canyon Fire. The average at Huntington is 74 degrees in July. I have, however, been there when it has climbed into the low 90s. Finally, the fuels that had accumulated from years of fire suppression in the Waldo Canyon are considered by Ms. Mabin and others to be one of the main contributors to the fire. The Hayman Fire Summary also lists this as one of the main causes of this devastating fire. I believe that the fuel situation in the Sierra Nevada forest and at Huntington Lake are similar in many ways to those of Waldo Canyon. I say this because I have spent time in both forests and also because of the documented observations of experts. One such expert's work I would like to refer to is that of Dr. Thomas M. Bonnickson. Let me start by telling you a little bit about Dr. Bonnickson. Dr. Bonnickson is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Forest Science at Texas A&M University, Research Scholar in Residence at California Polytechnic State University San Luis Obispo, and Visiting Scholar and Board Member of the Forest Foundation. Dr. Bonnickson earned a Bachelor of Science in Forestry with minors in Wildlife and Range Management, a Master of Science in Forest Ecology, and a Ph.D. in Forest Policy from the University of California, Berkeley. He joined the faculty at Texas A&M University after working as a professor of forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work over more than 35 years emphasizes the history and restoration of North America's forests. Dr. Bonnickson developed science-based strategies in 1994 and 1995 to deal with the wildfire threat in San Bernardino mountain forests and San Diego County brushlands in California. These strategies, developed with the help of state and federal agencies and community leaders, would have dramatically reduced the death and destruction caused by the fires in 2003 in Southern California. In a booklet entitled Protecting Communities and Saving Forests, Solving the Wildfire Crisis Through Restorative Forestry, Dr. Bonnickson states, historically, low-intensity fires were common in California. Most forests burned often and gently, with low flames creeping through grass and pine needles while licking benignly at the base of large trees. Where brush had grown dense or patches of older trees were unusually thick, flames would flare up, leaving in their wake small openings where young trees could flourish. These low-level fires were the norm for thousands of years. He goes on to say that these fires kept California's forests open with mosaic patches of trees of different sizes and ages on the landscape. Large, catastrophic fires were rare and forests teemed with wildlife. However, that has changed. Starting in the early 1900s, people began putting out forest fires and altering the natural fire regime. Without low-intensity fires to keep them open, forests began to grow more crowded. Many forests we see today are not natural, but far denser versions of their historic predecessors. Forests that just 150 years ago were described as being open enough to gallop a horse through without hitting a tree are now so dense you can barely walk through them. In California's mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forests, 500 or more trees per acre often now stand where less than 70 trees per acre stood historically. Today, most government-owned forests in the Sierra Nevada are about 10 times denser than natural. He continues, "This overcrowding has horrific implications on forest health and wildfire behavior. It also can have devastating effects on wildlife. The plants and animals that need sunny openings are disappearing. When grasses and shrubs get crowded out, the wildlife that needs that habitat for food or cover is lost. Streams are drying up as thickets of trees use all the water. Insect infestations and tree mortality are reaching epic proportions." Dr. Bonnickson was invited by the Huntington Lake Association to address cabin owners and campers about managing our forest and how to protect our community, wildlife, and our lake from catastrophic wildfires. He spoke prior to the association's annual meeting on Saturday, August 5, 2006, at the Lakeshore Lodge, and later that evening at Billy Creek Museum Campfire Program. The following is adapted from his remarks. Huntington Lake is a wildfire disaster waiting to happen. The forest is so overcrowded with trees that almost nothing could stop a wildfire. We can only hope that immediate action will be taken to prevent a catastrophe. The forest in and around the Huntington Lake community is beautiful and deadly. It is an old-growth red-fir Jeffrey pine forest filled with dead and dying trees, several layers of younger trees growing underneath, and large logs and thick litter on the forest floor. This is the kind of forest that burns the hottest. Even so, residents of Huntington Lake are fortunate to live in such a beautiful old-growth forest. It is truly magnificent. Old growth should always be part of the forest, but it shouldn't dominate the forest. Just like a human society of only elders is unsustainable, so is a forest of only old trees. Like society, a forest must have all ages represented to be viable. That means a mosaic of young trees grow in some places and old trees in other places. Such a forest is diverse, sustainable, and natural. The problem is that the whole forest is old growth. A wildfire burning in an old-growth forest can travel across the landscape at tremendous speed. It can travel 20 miles in a day and virtually sterilize soils. The inferno towering hundreds of feet above the ground and reaching 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal, as it passes through the forest and community. This is an unnatural megafire, and Huntington Lake could be in the middle of it. We have witnessed the mud and debris that washed into the lake during the July storms, utterly clogging large sections of the lake. Imagine how the lake would be filled with mud and debris in the seasons following a catastrophic fire. There would not be a forest to filter the water, impacting the entire Central Sierra watershed. There is only one solution to this crisis: manage the surrounding forest and expand the areas thinned around homes to 100 feet, as California regulations require. What makes the problem worse is the Kaiser Wilderness on the north side of the community where no management is possible. Therefore, every effort must be made to thin the forest below the lower edge of the Kaiser Wilderness. This wilderness area is not only a threat to the Huntington Lake community, but the community is also a threat to the wilderness. A fire starting on either side could spell disaster for the other side. Huntington Lake can only be saved by community leaders working together with the Forest Service to do what is best for both homeowners and the forest. I sincerely hope that this will happen, since it could avoid a wildfire catastrophe. As I said in the beginning, My purpose is to point out to you the devastation of the Waldo Canyon Fire and compare the conditions of the Pike Forest with the Sierra Nevada Forest, especially the conditions at Huntington Lake. I witnessed homes in Colorado Springs that were built in the early to mid-1980s to the late 1990s burn to the ground. According to Lessons Learned from Waldo Canyon, which is a review of the devastation of the actual homes that burned during the fire, the homes were built of fire-retardant materials, and the owners practiced fire prevention techniques, the same ones that are practiced by cabin owners at Huntington. But the cabins at Huntington were built as early as the 1920s, the 1940s, such as our cabin was, and more recent. Most are owned by families and have been passed from generation to generation and built before fire-retardant materials were developed or at least in common use. I fear that if something is not done soon, especially to diminish the abundant fuels around the cabins, we will have, as Dr. Bonnickson said, a wildfire disaster. So, what can we do about this? In addition to the continued fire prevention techniques practiced by most cabin owners, the Forest Service has a plan to thin the forest, tract by tract, around Huntington Lake. At quarterly information meetings sponsored by the Forest Service over the last 2 years, they have explained the history of the forest over the last 100 years, presented pictures of the forest during the 1920s to show the contrast between the state of the forest then and now, and explained what can happen to the area if a forest fire should occur. My mother, who has also been coming up to Huntington all her life and who attended these meetings, commented to me, "When I first started attending these meetings, I felt very protective of the forest, the beautiful trees, and the aesthetics around our cabin. But after hearing what was communicated by the Forest Service and doing some of my own research, I realized that we are going to lose these trees, either by fire, disease, or by responsible forestry practices." The Forest Service has already begun this project, a project to restore the forest to be consistent with the forest when the small, subtle, creeping fires that occurred prior to fire suppression were allowed to burn. They are thinning and removing trees to accomplish this. In an informational letter dated October 18, 2012, the District Forest Service Ranger Ray Porter explained, "The High Sierra Ranger District of the Sierra Nevada Forest is proposing a project under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act Authority known as the Huntington Basin Project, or Huntington Project. This letter details the conditions of the forest, the dangers presented, the history of the area, the projected plan of the Huntington Project, and encourages those interested to contact Zachary Tain. Since this letter was written, we've learned that Mr. Tain will be leaving the project, and the new contact person is Rebecca Schufelt, Recreation Technician for Special Uses." I'd like to end on a personal note. I hate to even think about what we've experienced in the Colorado forest near my home happening at Huntington, but I fear that if we don't participate in and support more aggressive fire mitigation projects, that is exactly what will happen. For this reason, I want to encourage support of the Forest Service in their efforts to preserve the beautiful place we all love, for us and for future generations. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope this information was helpful.